Washington's farewell choice that still shapes power. He could have stayed. Everyone expected him to. And by walking away, he changed power forever. When George Washington prepared to leave the presidency, there was no rule demanding it. No law required it. No tradition restrained him. The office was new, fragile, undefined. And the nation, still uncertain of itself, looked to him not just as a leader, but as a stabilizing force it feared losing. Washington understood that fear. He felt it himself. The country was divided. Political factions were hardening. Foreign powers watched closely, hoping weakness would emerge. Staying felt safe, familiar, reassuring. Leaving felt like risk. But Washington saw something deeper. He believed that power, once personalized, becomes difficult to surrender, that authority extended too long begins to feel deserved rather than temporary, and that a republic survives not because leaders cling to office, but because they prove it can function without them. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It formed over years of strain, of compromise, of watching political loyalty replace civic duty. Washington worried less about enemies abroad than about habits forming at home. Habits that could turn leadership into entitlement. As his second term ended, pressure mounted for him to remain. Supporters argued continuity, stability, national security. Washington listened carefully. Then he refused, not out of fatigue alone, but out of conviction. He believed the presidency must remain an office, not a possession. His farewell was not dramatic. It was deliberate, a warning disguised as guidance. He cautioned against faction, against foreign entanglement, against confusing ambition with service. But the most powerful message was not spoken. It was demonstrated. By stepping aside voluntarily, Washington introduced something unprecedented, a limit chosen rather than enforced, a precedent rooted in restraint rather than law. He showed that authority could be strong enough to release itself. This was the beginning of a choice that would outlast him, a decision that shaped expectations for every president who followed. That power could be held without being hoarded. That leadership could end without collapse. Washington did not just leave office. He taught the nation how to survive leaders leaving it. And that lesson would echo long after his voice was gone. The conflict deepened as Washington's example was tested by time, because precedent without enforcement invites temptation. As decades passed, the presidency grew stronger. Crises multiplied. Wars erupted. The office accumulated authority Washington never possessed. Each expansion made his farewell choice more remarkable and more vulnerable. What had once felt obvious began to feel optional. Presidents faced moments Washington never imagined. Civil war, economic collapse, global conflict. Each emergency raised the same quiet question: is now the time to stay? Stability could always be argued. Necessity could always be claimed. Washington's restraint became harder to maintain precisely because the presidency had become more powerful. Yet his example endured, not because it was convenient, but because it was instructive. Leaders knew that remaining too long risked comparison. Staying beyond expectation invited suspicion. The choice Washington made had transformed departure into proof of legitimacy. This was the emotional zenith of his legacy. Not admiration, but tension. The constant pull between continuity and renewal, between experience and renewal, between personal authority and institutional survival. Washington had anticipated this struggle. He understood that ambition would never disappear. He did not try to eliminate it. He tried to contain it through example, by showing that the highest form of authority was self-limitation. Even when later presidents tested the boundary, they did so knowing the weight of his choice. Breaking precedent required justification. Respecting it required sacrifice. Either way, Washington's shadow remained. The conflict was never fully resolved. It became cyclical. Every presidency would face it anew, and every leader would be measured against a man who chose to walk away when no one could force him to. The resolution arrived not through law, but through memory. Washington's farewell choice did not prevent ambition. It disciplined it. For more than a century, his example guided presidents more powerfully than any statute. Leaders stepped aside not because they had to, but because they were expected to, and expectation became tradition. Eventually, the tradition was tested. Crisis made permanence tempting. Power made restraint difficult. When the precedent was finally broken, the response was swift. Washington's choice was no longer left a memory alone. It was written into law. His restraint became permanent structure. This is why his story still shapes power. Washington did not just model leadership. He modeled its ending. He taught that legitimacy grows when authority proves it can relinquish itself. That stability comes not from clinging to office, but from trusting institutions to outlast individuals. The presidency exists today as a bounded office because of that first refusal to stay. Power now knows it must end. Leaders know they will be replaced. And the nation knows survival does not depend on a single person, no matter how revered. Washington's farewell was not dramatic. It was disciplined. And discipline, when repeated, becomes democracy. His choice reminds us that the strongest leaders are not those who stay the longest. They are those who know when to leave. What Washington's farewell also reveals is something about the relationship between example and enforcement. Most of the structures that constrain political power rely ultimately on enforcement. Laws, courts, elections, mechanisms that compel compliance regardless of individual preference. Washington's farewell choice operated differently. It relied on example, on the persuasive force of a single visible voluntary act, performed by a person whose authority was so undeniable that the act itself became the standard against which all future authority would be measured. That is an extraordinarily fragile mechanism. It depends on successors internalizing the example deeply enough to replicate it, on a culture that treats the precedent as binding even in the absence of compulsion, on the accumulated weight of repetition, making the choice feel inevitable rather than chosen. And yet, for more than a century, it worked. Not perfectly. There were leaders who stayed longer than they should have. There were moments when the precedent was tested, but the expectation itself held, because Washington had established something that enforcement alone cannot create, a standard of legitimacy. The idea that genuine authority includes the authority to relinquish authority, that the leader who cannot imagine stepping aside has revealed something disqualifying about their relationship to power. That restraint is not weakness. It is the proof of strength. This idea entered the political culture so deeply that when it was eventually tested directly, when a president sought a third term and won it in crisis conditions, the cultural response was to write the restraint into law, to transform the example into enforcement, to make permanent what Washington had demonstrated was possible. That transformation from example to law is what Washington's farewell choice ultimately achieved. Not immediately, not cleanly, but over a long arc of repetition and expectation and eventual codification. His restraint became the Republic's restraint. His farewell became the institution's boundary. His choice became every president's inheritance, not as a rule any of them chose, as a tradition they received from a man who proved it was possible and who trusted that proof to outlast him. It did. His choice reminds us that the strongest leaders are not those who stay the longest. They are those who know when to leave, and who trust that what they have built is strong enough to continue without them. That trust, demonstrated once, became the foundation on which democratic leadership has stood ever since, and who, in leaving, gave every leader who followed him both a gift and a responsibility. The gift of inheriting an office that had already proved it could survive their departure. The responsibility of ensuring that it could survive the next one. That is Washington's farewell, still echoing, not as history, as instruction, for every leader who will eventually face the same choice, and who will need to remember what the first one did, when no rule required it, and the nation was watching, and the Republic was still deciding what it was. Washington